Welcome to The Explainer. So today we're going to completely break down a classic 17th century tale. It's one that perfectly captures this hilarious and honestly sometimes tragic clash between grand imagination and mundane reality. We're diving headfirst into the world of Don Quixote, really unpacking how one man's absolute obsession with epic tales fundamentally altered his entire reality. I mean, think about that for a second. Have you ever been so completely absorbed in a story, maybe a movie or a book, that for a brief moment you actually forgot what was real? We've all got that innate desire for an epic life, right? That craving for adventure that shakes up the everyday routine. Well, today's explainer focuses on the guy from a village called La Mancha over in Spain who took his love of books and that deep desire for adventure way, way too far. Okay, let's dive into this. Section 1. The Knight's Grand Illusion. Right, so before we can really understand the journey, we have to understand the obsession that started the whole shebang. Our protagonist absolutely loved knights. And I'm not talking about just a passing interest here. He was utterly consumed by the idea of the medieval knight, a man who served his lord as a mounted soldier in armor. Every single day, he'd read these incredible, frankly unbelievable stories about courageous knights and their epic adventures. It got so bad he practically forgot to eat or sleep. It was basically the 17th century equivalent of the ultimate media binge, a super extreme form of escapism where the boundary between his actual reality and the fiction on the page just blurred completely. You can actually track his descent into madness in 3 pretty distinct steps. First off, all that reading completely overrides his basic human needs. Next, he stops being just a passive reader and starts actively imagining himself inside this medieval world. He literally becomes Don Quixote. And finally, well, because every knight obviously needs a loyal servant, he recruits Sancho Panza, a local peasant, to just join right in on his delusion. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth would a grounded, super rational peasant agree to follow a guy who hasn't been sleeping on a completely made-up quest? Well, Don Quixote framed it perfectly. On one hand, he offered the thrill, right? Accompany me on a great adventure. But the real hook, the actual clincher, was the tangible promise. Don Quixote assured Sancho that if he served faithfully and honestly, he'd reward him with an island, like a literal island. And for Sancho Panza, that practical promise of an island was just enough to make him say, "Yes, master, I'm in." Let's move along and see how this builds, mapping out the brief, chaotic, and frankly hilarious journey the duo is about to take. We're talking about their departure from La Mancha, straight into a violent collision with a windmill, then a literal ambush on local livestock, and finally, their totally humiliating return. So let's look at their first major hurdle. Section 2, the windmill battle. Okay, picture this. The newly minted knight and his squire are approaching a hill, and they spot their very first challenge on the horizon. Now, through Don Quixote's grand, highly dramatic perspective, they are staring down a hideous, terrifying ogre blocking their path. But through Sancho's very grounded reality, it's literally just a large, old windmill. Nothing more, nothing less. But to Don Quixote, this wasn't some clever metaphor. His eyes literally sparked at the sight of it. He genuinely believed, with his whole heart, that this structure was an ogre, a monster, a giant standing in total defiance of his noble quest. His reality was just entirely overwritten by his imagination at this point. And the comedic dynamic here is absolutely brilliant. You've got Don Quixote delivering this thunderous, epic battle cry, and Sancho Panza is just frantically looking around in total confusion. He's desperately trying to inject some basic logic into the situation, pointing out the obvious, that it's a windmill. But Don Quixote is so far gone, he just insists they are ogres and tells Sancho to go step aside and pray. Which naturally leads us to combat, fighting between armed forces. Except, in this case, the armed force is one completely delusional man and his horse, Rocinante. So, completely ignoring Sancho's frantic shouts and warnings, Don Quixote lowers his lance and charges the windmill at full speed. He flies right toward the spinning blades and, predictably, violently collides with the structure. Now, what's really interesting here is how Don Quixote processes this massive failure. It's an absolute masterclass in cognitive dissonance. When Sancho rushes over to check on his battered, bruised master, does Quixote finally admit it was a windmill? Of course not. No way. He proudly declares, "The ogre is more seriously wounded than I am." He literally bends the physical reality of his own broken body to protect his fragile fantasy. He justifies the whole violent collision by claiming they just have to vanquish villains so that someday people will write about their great exploits. Section 3. Prodigious Army of Sheep. So having somehow survived the windmill, the battered duo continues their journey. And as they pass a local farm, this thick cloud of dust appears on the horizon. Instantly, Quixote declares that a prodigious, meaning impressively great, army is marching toward them. He is so utterly convinced of this that he actually starts naming the imaginary leaders and principal knights he believes are commanding this massive force right there within the dust cloud. And once again, we see this incredible contrast. You have Quixote delivering this grand, soaring, dramatic monologue, listing off legendary knights preparing for war. And then you have Sancho, standing right next to him, totally deadpan, pointing out that he hears absolutely nothing but the bleating of many sheep and lambs. Because they were literally just sheep. But Don Quixote, never one to let actual facts ruin a perfectly good quest, tells Sancho that his fears are just preventing him from seeing clearly. And with that flawless, unshakable logic, the knight charges headfirst right into the middle of the flock. You can probably guess how this goes. It is a disastrous, deeply unheroic outcome. The frightened animals flee helter-skelter in total disorder. The shepherds, seeing some crazy guy attacking their livestock on horseback, get understandably angry. So they pelt Don Quixote with stones until he falls, once again totally wounded to the ground. His supposedly noble quest devolves into this highly undignified reality of just getting beaten by rocks from local farmers. So, the crucial point is, Section 4, the return to reality. Bruised, beaten, and utterly defeated, the duo makes their tragicomic return back to La Mancha. As they enter the village, the final delusion slowly starts breaking down. See, Quixote thinks the laughing peasants are welcoming them as heroes for their great deeds. But Sancho, gentle but very firm, finally has to ground him. He basically says, "Listen very carefully. They aren't welcoming us. They think you're crazy, and they are mocking you." And finally, the spell is broken. Eventually, upon returning to the quiet of his own estate, this deep, melancholic realization washes over Don Quixote. None of it was real. None of the ogres, none of the rival knights, none of the glorious battles. They were all fake. Every single adventure they went on was simply a product of his own imagination. Now, he never embarrassed himself on a physical quest ever again. The armor was put away for good. But, and this brilliantly illustrates the silver lining here, he didn't lose his love for the epic. He channeled that magnificent madness into something positive and safe. He kept his house full of children and spent his time passing down these fantastic, vivid tales of knights, squires, and noble quests to an entirely new generation. Which really leaves us with this final, profound question to ponder. Is it better to face a cold, boring reality like Sancho Panza? Or is there actual value in holding on to a little bit of epic delusion like Don Quixote? Perhaps the real magic is just finding that balance. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today, and I really hope it inspires you to look at the windmills in your own life just a little differently.